thanks so much to Ray, our roundtable members that actually ended up being one table member, Congressman Liu, and the wonderful members of Congress who spoke to us. And we are focused now on our next panel, which is focused and centered on banking on business to close the racial wealth gap and strengthening entrepreneurship in communities of color. Empowering people of color to build and own businesses can help reduce the racial and ethnic wealth gap by helping individuals to fulfill their potential to create wealth-generating opportunities for themselves and others. Equitable opportunities for entrepreneurship may also increase jobs, economic development in areas where people of color and those with lower incomes disproportionately reside, which in turn improves the health and socioeconomic status of vulnerable households and communities. I'll turn it over now to Kelvin Boston, the host of the PBS show MoneyWise with Kelvin Boston. And I ask the various panelists to come towards the stage.
Good morning. How you doing today? You got to be better than that. How you doing today? We are so delighted to be here and have such an important conversation about one of the most important drivers of asset building in our community, and that is entrepreneurship. I think it takes a lot of courage to really talk about this, because of all the things that's being talked about in the presidential election, one of the things I really haven't heard people talking about was entrepreneurship, especially for people of color. So let's give the Global Solution a round of applause again for being brave enough to bring this to the forefront and continuing this and making this a part of the conversation. Hi, I see a lot of friends there. I understand you all have remarks, so I'm going to introduce you first. I'll start with Connie, and then we'll let you give your remarks, and then we'll have our conversation. Is that fair enough? Okay, great. All right. Connie Evans is the, and by the way, you'll find their full bios in your books. Connie Evans is with the Association of Enterprise Opportunities. I'll let you give your remarks first. Is that fair, man?
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes, good. I am a strong proponent of supporting businesses and business ownership as a route to wealth building. At AEO, we have spent a great deal of our time focused on supporting businesses, but also conducting research that has demonstrated to us that wealth building is truly an outcome as an outcome for self-employment. At AEO, we support primarily micro businesses, but also micro capital, which is capital needs under $250,000. So I am looking forward to engaging in a discussion this morning that can focus us on how do we increase the rate of ownership by people of color, and how do we begin to increase the performance of these businesses. Again, most of our research has demonstrated that in looking at businesses that are owned by people of color, and particularly African Americans, which is where we've spent most of our research efforts, it is true that they are affected by a lower rate of entrepreneurship. Oftentimes that is being driven by the lack of a history of entrepreneurship in their families. I'm one of the lucky ones. I happen to be the product of a self-employed mother. And so I know it has made a difference in terms of my perspective, my attitude toward business ownership. And I think, again, the research bears me out that people who grow up exposed to ownership, business ownership, are much more likely to start a business than those who do not have that exposure or experience. So I think there are implications, of course, for that as we think about youth and young people. Another study that AEO is releasing within a month or so that looks at the opportunities to get younger people, millennials, having access to self-employment and business operations, so as they began to think about careers and opportunities for economic advancement, business ownership will be part of that thought process and their experience. Lastly, I think, again, as we think about business ownership, even if we start focusing on bringing more and more, again, particularly African Americans into business ownership, what do we do about their performance? Studies show that whether we're talking about credit performance or we're talking about business productivity and performance, there are still huge disparities when compared to white business owners. And so I think we need to look at some of the factors and drivers affecting that, as well as some of the solutions and opportunities that I'm sure this panel will be discussing. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. Gary Cunningham is the President and CEO of Metropolitan Economic Development Association. Thank you for coming this morning.
Thank you. And I am excited to be here. How many of you are excited to be here today? This conversation about the wealth gap and about people of color's relationship has to do with our democracy and whether our democracy will actually function moving into the future. And we know that as an African-American man, that we've been, as a people, been through a lot to get to the place we are. And so in order for us to transform America again, we have to fully participate in the economic aspects of this country. So now we have the right to vote, we have the right to live where you want to live, but we are not fully participating as citizens if we can't also participate in the wealth that gets generated within this country. And so part of what I've done and what we're doing at MEDA is trying to deal with these deep, toxic inequalities that are eating away at the fabric of our democracy. And the fact of the matter is that when you look at the wealth gap between people of color and white people, you look at the asset gap between people of color and white people, these are issues loom large and are going to take a huge amount of investment, resources, and structural change. Now, everybody loves change until it happens to them. You know, Mark Twain once said the only person he ever met that liked change was a baby with a wet diaper. And so the reality of it is that because of how the structures of opportunity have happened in this country, not everybody's similarly situated to that opportunity. And so when we talk about entrepreneurship, and we start talking about the growth of minority entrepreneurs, and Alejandra Austin's paper that all of you have really show an upward trajectory for entrepreneurship. In fact, Bransford out of the University of Seattle did a study, 10 years of panel data looking at what closed the wealth gap. And what he found was that the only area between blacks and white where the wealth gap closed was entrepreneurship. Those that were in business for themselves actually saw a reduction in the gap between whites and blacks, but if you were working for someone else, you didn't see that. Now at MEDA, you know, we've actually looked at this issue and have, let me back up a minute and tell you what we do. So we work, for the last 45 years, we've been working with entrepreneurs of color. We run 2 minority business development agency centers, one in Minneapolis and the other here in DC, the Federal Procurement Center. And what we do is we provide business support services, capital, and access to markets for minority entrepreneurs. And we've been doing that and we've been doing it successfully to build entrepreneurs of scale. So a lot of times when people think about minority people of color getting into entrepreneurship, they think about little bitty, just small businesses. And we need small businesses because the small businesses grow into large businesses. But we actually need to build businesses of scale. So for last year, for example, META worked with clients that represented $1.4 billion in revenue. They employed 8,000 people. Over 51% of the people working at these companies are people of color. So if we're going to address this issue, we hire people of color greater than anyone else. So if we're going to address these issues, we need to be able to build businesses of scale, and we need to build it throughout the whole landscape. But there's some areas that get in our way. One is assets that I talked about earlier. If you don't have assets, it's hard to get into business. If you don't have good credit, it's hard to get a loan. If you don't have access to capital, you can't grow your business. So all these things are tied together. And if you don't have the education, right, meaning, you have a good idea, but you need to put it to work, right? So, but what we're seeing, and there's a renaissance going on in America right now, and that renaissance is us getting into entrepreneurship. How many of you are entrepreneurs in the audience? Raise your hand. And for those of you that are not, start a business. Do it today. You may fail, but you need to come back and do it again, because at the end of the day, somebody got you to sit in these seats you're sitting in, and now it's your turn to do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. Our next speaker is Michael Barr. I have the privilege of serving with the FDIC Advisory Board with Michael. He's a professor of the University of Michigan Law School.
Thank you very much, Kelvin. I want to start by just marking a moment. So here we are at the Color of Wealth Summit. I've spent a long time at the Treasury Department, in addition to being at Michigan, and so it's particularly exciting for me to see this gentleman removed from the $20 bill. Andrew Jackson was a horrible man and an even worse president. And he also was opposed to paper money. So he should never have been on this bill for so many reasons. And then to learn he is being replaced by Harriet Tubman.
Wow.
I mean, what a remarkable thing. Just take a $20 bill out of your wallet and look at it now and think, how will I feel with Harriet Tubman on the front of it? I think that's enormously exciting moment for our country, not just symbolically, but actually and deeply. So I just wanted to start with that. So I think that the issue we're talking about today is important on lots of levels. It's important because if we want to have a country that is growing enough, we need to have more entrepreneurship in the United States, not just for minorities, but in general. And we live in a more heterogeneous country. We have more immigrants, more minorities, more diverse population than ever before. If we're going to grow enough, we need more entrepreneurs, and more of those entrepreneurs have to be women, have to be minorities, have to be immigrants. So the first reason I think this is absolutely critical is we need more entrepreneurs who are minorities and women if the country is going to grow enough. The second reason why I think it's really critically important is we, I think, want a country that's not just going to grow enough, but it's going to grow together. And that means having more minority and women entrepreneurs. We want to have a more inclusive economic system, as the earlier speakers suggested, a system that helps to close the racial wealth gap, an economic system that helps people get ahead and advance. And if we want to live in that kind of country, we're going to have to do a better job at helping women and minority entrepreneurs, at encouraging them, at welcoming them, at helping them grow and thrive. And for me, at least, that I think the three critical barriers that many entrepreneurs face, and it is more acutely felt by many, not all, but many minority and women entrepreneurs, are three basic issues: access to capital, access to the right mix of skills, and access to networks. So let me just say a word or two about each one, and then I'll sit down, or I am sitting down. I'll shut up. So capital, you need capital to grow. Minority businesses and women-owned businesses start out with lower levels of wealth, and often start out with lower credit scores. And that makes it much more difficult for them to access external sources of capital, which means they're much more likely to rely on their own wealth, which they have less of. So that's hard. So getting people better access to capital, I think the private sector can do a lot more. I think the government, we'll talk about some more in a minute, has a critical role to play through MBDA, through SBA, through the New Markets Tax Credit Program, through state credit programs supported by the federal government, the so-called SSBCI program, since we're in Washington, D.C. So capital is absolutely critical. The second one is access to skills. So lots of times, minority or women-owned businesses have some really great set of skills and then are missing some key pieces, like a portion of critical accounting or assistance with marketing. And we don't have really a great system for fixing that. There are short-term issues we need to do to make skills more accessible, of the kind that Gary was just talking about. And then there are longer-term issues like investment in science education for minority and women, getting more minority students, more women, girls into science education, math education, technology is a critical component. And last, networks. I thought that Representative Liu's comments on this were just extraordinarily on point. Just super. It is much harder to sell things if you don't have access to the people who buy things. And so networks, business networks, sometimes this is thought of as like in a narrow way as mentoring, of which there might be some part, but a lot of it is just access to business opportunity. Access to opportunity comes from networks. It's not intrinsic, objective, even, level. There's not a level playing field for networks. Networks are built over time. And so women entrepreneurs and many minority entrepreneurs don't have access to the full range of networks that are necessary to succeed. And I think we have to overcome that to build the kind of economic society we all want to have. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. I'm always how can I say, overwhelmed when I'm in the company of the next speaker. She's doing a wonderful job as National Director of Minority Business Development Administration. I had the opportunity to be with her at Operation Hope, where you just wowed everybody. Let's give it up for the one and only Ms. Alejandra Castillo. Thank you for being here.
I think this is on. Let's see. Oh, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for those kind words. I will say this. The speakers have already stole all my information. And you've done a wonderful job. But I'm going to take it a couple of 10,000 feet up, because I get the privilege to travel this country. And the exciting thing about what's happening, and it's exciting, is that the data is irrefutable. This country is changing, and it is changing fast. And it is changing in a way that it's looking more like this room. So when you hear the data that in 2044, the country will be a majority minority, I'm sorry, thank you. That this country will be majority minority, that's real. So as Michael was saying, and I say it in a different way, if this nation is going to remain globally competitive, this wonderful country that we live in, it is no longer an invitation for minorities to be entrepreneurs. It is a must. It is an imperative. We are the supply chain. We are the next titans of industries. So yes, we have to start businesses. We do start small, but we need to scale, and we need to scale fast. So having said that, let me also bring another, what I call tectonic plate that is also happening. And we hear this from Michael Frey and from others. It's the graying of America. So who's investing into our Social Security? And it's 44 million millennials. And those 44 million millennials are also majority minority. And they call it the gig economy. They are entrepreneurs in their DNA. So we need to help our young people understand entrepreneurship as well. And I need to give a shout out to my colleagues from SBA. I know Tamika Montgomery is here, I saw her, who's doing a great job when it comes to disseminating information and training and all of that. We work very closely with SBA, but at MBDA, our focus is growth. How do we scale? How do we make sure that minority businesses are not kept small? Because there's always this issue about, you talk about minority and there you go, oh, these small companies. And I take umbrage to that. Because there's something about when you talk about small, it's like, well, let's put them over here. They don't play in this other arena. And I take it personal. I really do, because when you're in this other arena, there's a lot of money there. There's a lot of money. We should not be talking about access to capital. But let's talk about access to capital. Sometimes when we talk about access to capital, well, you know, our financial records are not in order. We don't have this, we don't have that. There's always this conversation about lack of. And I want to invite our communities to talk about, let's move away from a poverty-driven platform, which is a platform that talks about the lack of, the scarcity of. We need to be talking about the asset-driven platform. So when you shift the narrative, it opens up. There's optimism. And I'll stop because I want us to have a conversation. But we need to also short-circuit something else, and that is technology and innovation. When they say we can't find them, and we hear this from Silicon Valley, well, we can't find them. We need to make ourselves visible in this space. MBDA is trying to leverage the R&D that the federal government produces. We will be in Chicago next week at the Federal Lab Consortium. The federal government has over 300 federal labs. It spends over $400 million a year in research and development. Great scientists that are doing just amazing things. Let's bring our MBEs to access that R&D and commercialize it, right? I grew up hearing that necessity is the mother of invention. If that's the case, then you know what? We should be at the forefront. And we should be able to get that R&D and commercialize it. So let's short-circuit that. There's a lot of things that we are able to do. But I'll tell you this. I don't want to have this conversation amongst us, right? We should be in other venues as well, because we need to be having conversations and breaking down the silos. It's wonderful to come to these gatherings and talk about our challenges and identify solutions. But we also need to start partnering with others and accessing the capital of others and access and leveraging the ideas and the network of others. So I'm grateful to my colleagues on this stage. I'm hoping and I'm challenging us all that as a public servant, you will also come to Commerce, because Commerce is not just MBDA. It's also EDA. It's also the International Trade Administration, you know, and accessing Treasury and accessing SBA. You know, I'm shameless. We need to be partnering with everyone in the federal government because there are resources out there. I want to be a conduit for those resources. So thank you.
Thank you, Alejandra. Wow. We're going to have a conversation now. I'm going to throw out some questions. And our main focus is how can we look at entrepreneurship and let's say business ownership as well as a way of closing the racial wealth gap. Our friends at Prudential did, I think, a landmark study on the African American financial experience. And one of the things that I took away from that study, and then for the last 3 years I've been talking about it around the country, is that study found that 25% of African Americans wanted to start their own businesses, but they did not know how to get started or where to find the capital. Now, one of the unique things you should understand, my beloved, is that 25% of African Americans want to own their own business. That is a big deal. I'll give you a quick example. When I started my business many, many years ago, the first person I called was my mother. I was so excited. And I said, Mom, I'm going to have my own business. And I heard this long, loud silence on the other end of the phone. And then my mother spoke. She said, baby, what you doing going into business? You're not a businessman. She said, you don't know nothing about business. You ain't been at business. I don't think you got no damn business going into business. I mean, that's how my mama talks. And for a long time, I thought she was right because, you know, those first years were pretty mean years. And in those mean years, I would have some nightmares. And in my nightmares, my mother would be chasing me around the room, demanding the money back that she gave me for college. And in my dream, she'd be saying, you're not a businessman. You're not a businessman. You're not a businessman. But it's interesting. We finally turned things around. And a few years ago, my mother had a birthday, and I was kind of busy. So I just sent her a check. And she was so nice. And she called me, and she said, baby, you're such a good business man. So my point is, it's important as a race that we begin to overcome our fear of entrepreneurship, because what my mother was really doing was sharing her fear, as many African-American mothers and fathers have. That's why they always said, go get that good job. And for us to now say we want to go into business is a big, important thing. But the question to the panel was, how do we overcome our fear, and how do we get started? And what can we start sharing with other people about how they can get started? Anybody can.
Well, I'll take a shot at it. So there's a study by Rob Farley, who looked at minority youth and their interests in entrepreneurship, and it found that African American young people had a much higher rate of being interested in and having an aptitude for entrepreneurship. And then when they got older, they fell out of that. So something happened where they had huge aspirations, a desire to be in business, and then all of a sudden they're the least likely group to go into entrepreneurship. So we actually need, I think, to start building the scaffolding at the beginning to nurture that belief that I can and that I will be an entrepreneur, and I will give that a shot as a part of my experience. So, you know, part of that for a lot of us, I think, comes from not being family members being entrepreneurs, because what they find is people that have had a history in entrepreneurship actually do better in business as they get in business, because they've had some acculturation to being in business. So the more that we can actually build that and nurture that power of those young people, so that's one thing. I think the second thing on that same question is this issue of there's too many wrong doors for business support services for entrepreneurs of color. Accenture helped us do a study that really looked at the ecosystem of minority entrepreneurship, and we found that it's very fragmented, meaning that you can go to 5 different doors and not get the right service at the right time for the right reasons, and then you get frustrated within that process. And so those issues of actually creating one front door is what we're working on now, so that there's one platform that you can go to and get assessed, that you can then go in and get education that you need. You can go in and get matchmaking services for the network, all on one platform, so that when you're a minority entrepreneur, you get that help that you need appropriately, and you get access to capital, which is the #1 issue that I see for entrepreneurs that we work with.
Let me just say, I totally agree with that. I think we also need to lower the barriers. So I'll just give you 2 quick examples. one of my students did a paper on the venture capital industry, which is white and male predominantly, and looked at venture capital groups that have at least one woman involved in the group, just one, and then looked at the performance of women-owned businesses funded by those VCs that had a woman and didn't have a woman. And the VCs that had at least one woman, the women-owned businesses that they funded did really well. And the ones that didn't have at least one woman, the women-owned businesses did badly, or didn't do as well, I should say. So sometimes the barriers are big, but overcoming them doesn't take very much. Just hire one woman. Mm-hmm. So getting rid of the barriers.
I'm sure
is
Hillary
one.
likes that remark, but we won't go there.
Yeah, if you hire the woman to the right job, that matters a great deal, right? So second, just example, I do some work in the city of Detroit, which is on a wonderful comeback, I think. And I worked with the J.P. Morgan Chase Foundation and the Kellogg Foundation to help set up a fund for minority entrepreneurs in Detroit neighborhoods. And people said, you're not going to find any businesses to fund. Why would you do that? And Chase and Kellogg put $6.5 million in, and it's being run by Ray Waters at the Detroit Development Fund, who's a wonderful guy. And Ray is finding wonderful businesses to fund who are doing great work in the city of Detroit, who started in Detroit neighborhoods, and they were not hard to find.
Okay. Connie?
Yeah, I want to go back to this issue of starting wealth, because I do think it's a huge barrier that the lack of wealth in many communities of color prevent people from starting a business or even having a successful start if they're able to start. When crowdfunding happened, and many of us in this room worked on that Jobs Act, and we're really anxious to see that crowdfunding was going to be the saving grace, right? It was going to skip over a lot of the barriers that are inherent biases and some other things that we think about in terms of accessing capital through banks and other financial institutions. But there's a little issue about crowdfunding. Crowdfunding works. A successful crowdfunding campaign has 3 levels. The first level is friends and family. Okay? Most of us don't have friends and family that have any greater wealth than we have. And so when we're talking about the lack of starting wealth, it really is a problem, even when you're looking at being as creative about crowdfunding. So starting wealth is a real issue, friends and family. The next round of successful crowdfunding is accessing the social media opportunities of friends and family. And so again, you're right kind of back, and then that third tier goes to the network of the campaign itself, or the engine, the platform, whether it's Indiegogo or whoever it is. So I think that means there are some opportunities to be creative as a community, as entrepreneurs, and particularly social entrepreneurs, to find some ways to help deal with that first round. We need to start with savings and all those things, but for some of us, that's kind of too late. So what can we do now that we can think creatively of how do we replace that first tier of funding? How can we come up and think about cultural opportunities? So let's, for example, take, I know growing up in the South, there were things called rent parties in the Black community. We used to come together, pool monies together to help pay rent. That could be a first round of funding. Why don't we think about, is there a way to look at some of our cultural practices from the past and replace or come up with an alternative that would serve as the equity, if you will, for friends and family in something like a crowdfunding campaign? I think that's what it's going to take to really try to deal with how do we get past the issue of the low starting wealth for business startup. The other thing, the next thing that I would point out in terms of, again, how do we get more people in business, in addition to what we both have said about youth and young people having opportunities, I think we also have to think about, are there policy issues that can deal with credit issues. We know that, again, more often than not, people of color, particularly African Americans, have more problems with their credit. Is there a moratorium? Is there something that we can insert that bypasses or overlooks what has happened in terms of the credit? Whether it was your house payment and mortgage payment that brought you down. For women, when I was running a CDFI, I knew all the time, women, if you were divorced, you had real bad credit issues because that's the position you were left in, kind of holding that. So there are a lot of issues that have nothing to do with, oh, I'm just not going to pay the bill, that maybe we should think about, again, a creative way. We have pardons and we bypass lots of things. Is there a way to come up with some kind of moratorium or pass over of your credit rating so that it would not be considered? Then lastly, I think we do have to do more for those organizations like CDFIs and other nonprofits who are helping or in the business to help support startup businesses. I think we have to be a bit more creative. Alejandra talked, I think I got your name right? Alejandra talked about partnerships. I think it's critically important that we think about cross-sector partnerships. Most CDFIs will not have the capacity to take on the type of technology that's available and the underwriting that's available from online lenders. Now, there is a lot of talk about how awful online lenders are, but they have some things that are going right for them. They've been able to figure out how to use more than 2,000, in some cases, indicators, pieces of information and data, really using big data analytics to do their underwriting that dismisses a little bit about that credit score or the bad credit score and some of the other things. It looks past that and not make decisions based on FICA. I think a combination of, again, looking back at our cultural roots and being creative to find solutions to starting low wealth, being able to have cross-sector partnerships that take advantage and leverage the big data and analytics capability we find, particularly in online lenders marketplace, and being able to think about rational government policies that could maybe begin to look differently at the situations that people have found themselves in, all toward addressing creatively this issue of low starting wealth, which we know is a real barrier to starting or being a successful startup.
Great.
I just wanted to jump in very quickly. Michael, and I'm sure you can appreciate this. First of all, I want to thank the audience for being in DC. And I know that you take your time, energy, and money to come here. But three things always I underscore. This town is about policy, programs, and budgets. Budgets, critical. The fact that you come here, we need to understand this town works on 3-year cycles. And the reason I bring that up is because when we talked about, when Gary was talking about youth, the president in his FY17 budget for MBDA, the first time, and I'm so sad to say, but it is the first time in over 15 years that our agency gets an increase. And one of those increases was for a youth entrepreneurship program, because we have to ensure that minority youth are in this stream of entrepreneurship. So I'm very pleased to, hopefully, this Congress will make sure that we get that money to make sure that minority youth are actually prepared to be in that stream. So that's one thing. And when you come to DC, you have to be very aware of which budget cycle are you actually advocating for. Because if you're trying to influence the FY16 budget, you know, you're late. Or if you're trying to influence the FY17 budget, well, you're kind of late. So you have to understand where you are in that process. But let me go to Connie's point, policies. Experian just put out an interesting research on minority businesses. You know, we're meeting with Experian because I'm puzzled. What's the algorithm that they actually use when they determine these scores? And when was the last time they actually revisited that? And how do you influence that, if at all? And how do they distinguish minority businesses? Are there factors that should be distinguishable? I mean, how do we engage in that conversation in this era of big data? As you were saying, online lenders are actually being very creative. So there was an article the other day about how big data is actually hurting minority communities. We have to be at the forefront of analyzing how these new technologies are either impacting us in a positive or negative way. And these are the type of policy discussions that when you come to Washington, you should be prepared to engage. So these are the interesting conversations that are not just intellectual conversations, but conversations where you're the architect of how policies are being designed and implemented and hopefully enforced. Because it doesn't help us to have policies that are hopefully beneficial to minority communities if they're not going to be enforced. And I know, Michael, you've been at Treasury. We have to be also mindful, are these policies being enforced in any particular way?
Great. As a way, again, to continue our conversation about how entrepreneurship can close the wealth gap, I'd like to remind you that a few years ago, our friends at the Gallup Corporation, they wrote a very great book entitled The Coming Jobs War. And in this book, it outlined the fact that corporate America will never create enough jobs to put all Americans back to work. And you look at what's going on in terms of the unemployment rates in our communities. And so they came out to the conclusion that it was important, imperative, that we have a national program to create more entrepreneurs, period. And from this study and my work with the Gallup Corporation, we developed a philosophy at MoneyWise that we're now taking across the country. So every time we're at one of our events across the country, we bring out this point. Every African American family must own a business. It's the only way we're going to bring down the unemployment rate in our community. But I'd like to get our panelists' thoughts on this, and again, as it relates to how entrepreneurship can, again, close the wealth gap by creating more jobs and other opportunities in our communities.
Let me just say a quick thing at the start, which is I totally agree. I mean, I think that that's the basic theme of the opening statement I made, which is if we're going to grow as a country enough, we're going to create enough jobs, we're going to have more minority entrepreneurs and more female entrepreneurs, and that is especially true in minority communities and for minority communities. So I think that's absolutely clear. Just because this is in my disposition, one note of caution, which is, most businesses fail. And doesn't mean most business owners fail, but they start many businesses. Most of those businesses fail before they find one that works, hopefully. But so it is really, really hard. And many people fail at it, and some people shouldn't try it. But it is we're going to have more of it.
Well, I also wanted to say the question then is, if that's our pursuit, then let's tease the question out. What type of businesses?
Exactly.
In what type of industries? Are we all going to focus domestically, or are we going to look at exporting? And I will submit to you, when you look at the fact that 96% of the world's consumers live outside of the U.S., then it begs that we should be looking at exporting opportunities. And minorities are twice as likely to export because of linguistic and cultural ties. And when you look at the world and you're saying that 12 of the fastest growing economies are in Africa, then you are again, you're directed to look at, well, what could I be exporting? So we have to understand that the issue of every minority should have a business, that's great, but let's be very thoughtful and strategic. We don't all want to have, the classical service, like in my father's case, a bodega. We can't have a grocery store, right? We would be saturated. We want to be able to move our minority businesses into those industries of tomorrow. So there has to be a very thoughtful strategy to be able to move our business owners into those areas where there's a higher profit, where there's a growth area. I'm very passionate about advanced manufacturing. When you look at 3D manufacturing, it's fascinating. But how many people can actually move into that industry tomorrow? It's very capital intensive. It's going to require you to understand, software and a lot of different issues. But it is an industry that's going to be exploding. So let's be very thoughtful. And I know that we're running out of time, but I'll tell you, MBDA is looking at how do we move minority businesses into those industries of tomorrow, because the economy is moving fast, and we need to be prepared. If we stay in this, in trying to do business as we did it in the 20th century, we're going to find ourselves next year talking about the same problems.
Great.
If I could just add, I think another strategic way to address this issue and the goal that you put out for everyone to own a business, I mean, the reality is that 92% of all businesses in this country are micro. They have 5 or fewer employees. Not 92% of black businesses, not 92% of small businesses, 92% of all businesses in the United States are micro businesses. And so I think one of the things that we can do strategically is to target those businesses. AEO has a campaign that's been ongoing now called the 1 in 3, and a report that supports this activity. But it comes from a real data point. If 1 in 3 Main Street micro businesses hired just 1 employee, the country would be at full employment. And so if we're talking about job creation, we don't need all of those businesses to all of a sudden grow and start hiring tens and hundreds of people. That would be great for those that can do that, but that's not realistic for all of those 26 million businesses around the country that are micro. If 1 in 3 hired just 1, the country would be at full employment. So as a job creation strategy, I think, again, finding cross-sector partnerships and opportunities, because this cannot be solved by any one entity alone. So finding the opportunities to collaborate and bring the types of resources, capital, the types of, and it's not just, you might run a loan fund out here. It's not enough for, let's pick on JP Chase. I think they're one of our wonderful sponsors today. It's not enough for just JP Chase or any lender to just give you more capital. That's not going to solve the problem. It's about what type of capital we as CDFIs are putting out there. It's the availability of new products, some of the underwriting kinds of things that we've been talking about at this panel this morning, making those changes in the type of capital products that are available to businesses so that they can have access, have availability of the right type of product, and then be able to use that to scale and grow their businesses. The research is clear. Those businesses that grow will hire, and it's clear that they hire people who look more like them. And so if we can get these businesses the resources they need in the format and the framework of way they need it, we could begin to get the 1 in 3 to grow and hire 1 so that we are able to reach full employment in our communities.
Great. We're going to take some questions from the audience at this time.